If I may take a point of personal privilege, I'm actually turning 65 in mid-August. I know it doesn't look like it, but folks, it's the way it is. So right after my birthday, my daughter's going to come to Springfield, and we're going to have a big Sunday morning gathering service and party at Galloway Station. I'm inviting all of our musician friends to come and be a part of that celebration, and I hope that it'll be a happy occasion for us all. And those of you in the internet world, if you've been thinking, I really should get to Springfield and meet this church in person, that's your day, August 15. Make your travel plans now. But we do come to this Memorial Day weekend with a shared and a historically unique sense of grief, not about past wars, but with a painful awareness that 600,000 Americans have died during the pandemic just in the United States, 3.5 million globally, more than have died in all of America's wars in the 20th and 21st centuries. We are beginning to see the end of it here, with declining numbers of infections and a very rapidly deployed vaccination program that now boasts several types of vaccines that I just have to say are a miracle of science. The fact that they exist and that they work so well is a source of real pride in what the people who take science seriously have been able to do for us. I'm actually leaving for Brazil tomorrow morning. I'll just be down there for 10 days, but the virus is still spreading there, and the death rate is actually still escalating and will very shortly rival the death toll of the United States. But even there, vaccines are finally reaching the people that I know and love who live in Brazil, and I trust that by the end of the year they will be caught up to where the United States is now. But the end of this pandemic does not mean that things will return to normal. Some things have changed and will never ever be the same. I trust that all of us know that we should never again ride in a commercial aircraft or a subway or a train or a bus without wearing a mask. Most of us are aware, if you've got any contact with the medical community, that the flu season virtually didn't exist this year because we were wearing masks and maintaining some social distance. And so we've learned a little bit about viruses and how to protect ourselves. This will be our last Sunday to meet here in this music venue that has been so gracious to give us space since we had to sell our building. But even this venue has been sold to new owners, and tomorrow will open under a new name. Some of my very favorite local restaurants have closed, and they will not be reopened. Any drive around town reveals immediately how many retail shops and business services are now closed that have economically collapsed during the pandemic. And I haven't been able to find any real data on how many churches will not survive the months-long online-only services. As our board member Rob Martin observed in our board meeting this week, our little seated congregation has been in slow decline for several years, but the pandemic and months of quarantine have accelerated that decline towards the inevitability of a transition for us to become an almost exclusively online church. I simply cannot tell you how much that has grieved me, as I feel like I'm now preaching a eulogy for this congregation that we started in 2008. I have long believed that old traditional forms of religion have, quite frankly, been out of date and often worse than irrelevant, for more than 200 years. And I thought they would pass away, and that new progressive communities of faith would emerge and grow strong. I personally can't even relate to most of what happens in a Christian church or a Jewish synagogue or an Islamic mosque. Almost all of it seems to be perpetuating magical thinking and denial of reality in ways that are not helpful. They're not rational. They're not teaching ethics. But what I see on the horizon right now at the end of May in 2021 is a lot of successful toxic religion, while I'm having to also personally experience the demise of academic, relevant, and nurturing faith. Which is why David Ketchum and I have resolved to keep our progressive messages alive on YouTube and iTunes for as long as we can find enough support around the world to keep offering an informed, progressive perspective to our thousands of listeners who've not only come to depend upon us, but who write to me and tell me that they feel even more isolated than we have felt, because we have at least had a small community of progressive, similarly minded folks that we could be with. Most of them feel more isolated. And if you don't mind me making a plug, while we know that we download more than 15,000 messages a month to our global audience, we receive donations from only 60 or 70 of those listeners, some of whom are donating as little as $1 a month. And so to be able to keep doing what we have been doing to provide this resource, we're going to need donations from a couple of hundred folks at least. Now, David and I have rented an office here in Springfield, which will serve as our business office and our recording studio. And out of that office, we're going to try to coordinate some local relief service projects that our constituency can still engage in, and to plan some social gatherings for the remnant of our church so that we don't become isolated or feel all alone in the world. David is already very involved in various support groups that serve gay and trans and non-conforming communities, as well as coordinating the English language Buddhist services and working with the local chapter of Black Lives Matter with Native American groups and other poverty-related concerns. That's why when he joins us on Zoom, he so often has to sign off and leave to do another meeting before we finish ours. I will begin a semi-retired life after August, when David and I will begin to divide the preaching task for the next few years. So I will also be dividing my time between Springfield, Missouri, and other places. I'm now opening my calendar to begin to book speaking engagements in other states in those churches that are also just now emerging from their quarantine. So if any of you listening would like to try to get onto my speaking schedule, just be sure before you contact me that you can cover basic traveling costs. I will do my best to come and be a part of your faith community on the Sundays when you are gathering. I'm inexpensive, but we can no longer afford to subsidize my travel. So all of you who contact me with invitations that start with, the next time you happen to be in Calgary or Edinburgh or Boston, please understand, it doesn't work that way anymore. You have to get me there. I cannot resist taking this opportunity to say a memorial word about our own journey as a church. In 2007, I had a parting of company with both the church I had served in Springfield for 16 years and the denomination I had served for 30 years. I planned to write a book about that whole fiasco over the next couple of years, but when I felt that my days of preaching were over forever, I did agree that I would lead a book study for a group of other church alumni to talk together about how the traditional churches had failed us. They had failed us intellectually. They had failed us morally. We talked for 4 months about the social justice issues that really ought to be at the core of any ministry and the kinds of ways that our former churches had both wounded us and driven us away. In that group that met in a little Methodist church downtown, we were former Catholics, former Pentecostals, as well as former Jews, Unitarians, disciples, and Methodists. And after coming to a point of general agreement about what church really ought to be ethically, one woman bravely raised her hand and ventured, "Well, why don't we start our own church?" Which is, on the face of it, a very reasonable question to ask. I turned and went to the blackboard and I began to write down the elements of a traditional church service. And as I wrote, I turned and asked for a show of hands among those 50 or 60 people gathered there. Which of these elements should be a part of our new church's services? Some wanted to do away with hymn singing. Others insisted that we sing those repetitious hymns of praise. Some wanted to do away with intercessory prayer. Others thought that prayer should be the primary thing that we did. Some wanted a fairly traditional theology. They just wanted us to be more inclusive of different sexual identities and those often excluded from traditional services, such as the divorced, the chronically poor, or racial minorities. After a lengthy conversation, we realized that among the 50 or 60 of us gathered there, that we couldn't get any 6 of them to attend any one service that we could design. This is often the curse within liberal groups. Even when you agree on 80 or 90% of the core elements of what ought to make a community of faith, many liberals feel that if they cannot have 100% exactly what they personally want, then they just pick up their toys and head for the door. At that time, I'd gone to work for a non-governmental relief agency that was doing medical, educational, and housing work in Nicaragua. I honestly did not expect to ever go back to a church service. Not because I didn't miss being in community, and not because there were not aspects of church services that I desperately wanted to have in my life, but because, quite simply, there were no churches that I could find that were worth going to. And I tried. I tried a few weeks and either fell asleep from boredom or started crying from how pathetic the content of the service was. This is something I'd seen when I was a graduate student at Vanderbilt. In the divinity school where I went to seminary, there were a couple of dozen very famous professors, but over the years there I realized that only 3 or 4 of them ever actually attended a church. So I asked one of my professors that I had grown closer to over the years why he didn't go to church. And his flat-footed reply was, "I'm still waiting to find one that is worth going to." And now I get that better than ever. In a recent program I did with Jay Tomlinson, the host and producer of the news podcast, The Best of the Left, we discovered in the breakout sessions that my involvement in that program had lit a fuse among the participants, all of whom wanted to tell their personal stories about how they had been traumatized by the church that they had been forced to attend when they were young. In fact, David and I are going to be hosting a meeting on Zoom on Tuesday evening, June 22nd, to discuss how to overcome religious trauma. You'll find a link to that event on our Emerging Church Facebook page. Now, a lot of churches have done a lot of good through the decades. But honestly, it is difficult to tell, isn't it, whether they've done more good than they have done harm. There have been very many good things, but there has also been a lot of damage. Even today, 2021, the majority of churches synagogues, and mosques sharply discriminate against women. You cannot be a Catholic priest unless you have boy parts, which, after 44 years of preaching, I have never used in the writing and delivery of a sermon. Most churches, synagogues, and mosques sharply discriminate against gay, lesbian, and trans folk. They ironically still keep silent in the face of racism, and they're only interested in symbolic charity in the face of poverty. They virtually never take a real prophetic stance about changing the economic system that creates poverty. There will never be enough charity to solve poverty. And yet that is almost all that any church ever talks about, which is a way of simply demeaning the poor to keep them as a second or third class citizen. And even the more socially liberal among them still teach people to believe in magic and fairy tales, which I believe contributes to the overall dumbing down of society. If after all of these years that we've met together on Sundays, you can't remember any quote from me, you should at least remember my favorite quote from Voltaire, that anyone that can make you believe in absurd things can make you commit atrocities. I think that's why America tolerates poverty. It's why America tolerates racism. It's why we keep going into stupid wars where we have no business, that we have raised most of our population to believe in completely untrue, silly myths and superstitions. And so when a politician tells them, oh, they've got weapons of mass destruction, even though we've taken away their Navy, their Army, and all of their missiles, they somehow have got Harry Potter's magic wand and can do us great damage, and we'll just march our own children off to war. We are trying to figure out how to preserve what is good without repeating what is harmful. And you know what? That is harder to do than you might imagine. Over the past 14 years, we have gone through several evolutionary iterations. For years, we tried to grow into being a full-service church with classrooms for all ages, choirs, mission trips, and projects. But even with a huge expenditure of energy and resources, we could never satisfy enough people at the same time to sustain any of those efforts. For these past few years, we have accepted that our primary focus is not on what we do in Springfield, Missouri, and certainly not just on ourselves, but that our most important role is to continue to produce relevant, current, progressive material for a global audience. I wish we could have done both. And you have to know that I've tried. I wish that we could have built up a flagship for progressive people right here so that all over the world we could have been the laboratory that could show other progressive groups how to start and sustain a church. We did that for a few years. We brought people to town who stayed with me for weeks at a time, trying to understand what we were doing and how they could do it in their community. But to be honest, with or without the pandemic, we were going to economically run out of steam. The major donors who got us started are all either now deceased, moved away, or disabled. The world is changing rapidly, and for us to remain relevant, we are going to have to make painful changes. And one of the things that you learn first in the study of psychology is that all change is experienced as a loss. Even changes for the better, changes that will keep us alive and relevant and putting out new material, it will initially feel like a loss. Inevitably today, we will find ourselves at more or less the same point I was at in the fall of 2007 in that basement of a church in downtown Springfield leading that book study. No one will get everything that they want. but we must become what progressives all over the world need for us to be. We started our church all those years ago leaning heavily upon the writing of the world's most famous religious scholars, Marcus Borg, Karen Armstrong, John Dominic Crossan, Sister Joan Chittister, and my good friend who's been to Springfield to lecture here 3 different years, Bishop John Shelby Spong. But all of these A-listers have just gotten old on us. Marcus Borg has died. Bishop Spong has suffered a debilitating stroke. Sister Joan is 85 years old, and Karen Armstrong still speaks now and then for a fee of $85,000, which says to me she doesn't want to speak very often. Even though the talks that Bishop Spong delivered from our pulpit continue to be very, very popular on our YouTube channel, even decades ago, these pillars of progressive thought were only producing 4 or 5 original videos a year. We produce more than 50. Arguably not as popular or of the same quality as Marcus Borg or John Shelby Spong, but they never had to do 52 original sermons in a year. Our content does not focus, as all of these previous scholars typically have, on rehashing interpretations of ancient religious texts. We're trying to offer a spiritual perspective on current events. Their work will remain an important resource, but in a world where Donald Trump happened, and a global pandemic, an insurrection that threatened to undo democracy, and the current threat of hacking of our water, energy, and flight systems by global bad actors, and even how many mass shootings were there this week? Was it 2 or was it 3? We need more than occasional talks about the Bible. Our spirituality cannot be confined to the leather covering of ancient texts. We need something other than what I see now as being violence and fear pornography that only passes as a 24-hour news cycle that is filled with partisan and divisive commentary. We will endeavor to inform you of things that the news often avoids. We will try to speak on behalf of those that most of the world ignores. We will try to inspire, and if nothing else, at least get people to think about their assumptions about ethics and justice, to think about it in a new way, and to open their minds to new understandings. And beyond angry and cynical reactions to unsavory current events, I want us to strive to be a source of hope. Hope in a new way of living and in a new world. We will try to create community in our Springfield area through regular service projects and gatherings, and we will continue to offer Zoom meetings and events for our global audience as long as they are wanted and attended. We hope that we can count on you for your support to keep David and me employed at least part-time so that we can continue to be a full-time source of annoyance to governments, corporations, bigots, and fascists, because you all know that's what you really want us to do.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.